The weight of the cross that changed everything. Prologue. Warm blood. His blood was warm. I didn't expect that. When that Roman soldier dragged me out of the crowd on the Via Dolorosa, when he pointed at that beam lying in the dirt and shouted, "You, Cyrenian, pick that up," when my hands touched the rough wood stained with red, the blood was warm, alive, pulsing. And when the man turned, staggering, destroyed, unrecognizable, and our eyes met for a fraction of a second, I saw peace where there should have been only despair. How could a man on his way to the cross have peace in his eyes? But for you to understand how I, Simon ben Malki of Cyrene, arrived at that moment, carrying the Messiah's cross without knowing it, I need to go back to the beginning. To the smell of rotten fish at the harbor, to the sound of a knife cutting through air, to the day I discovered that being Jewish in Cyrene could mean losing everything. Chapter 1. The First Blood. I was 7 years old when I first saw my father bleed. It wasn't in battle, it wasn't defending our home from thieves. It was because of 2 denarii in the pride of a Greek merchant named Lysander, who decided my father had cheated him in a wheat transaction. It was mid-morning. The Cyrenian sun was already high and cruel, reflecting off the white columns that adorned the central marketplace. I was beside my father, holding a basket of grain samples. My job was to carry things, stay quiet, and learn the business. Malchi, my father, was negotiating with one of the ship captains who transported our grain to Rome. The man was enormous, arms thick as tree trunks, face burned by the sun, a scar on his chin. He examined the wheat with surprisingly delicate fingers, letting the golden grains slip through his calloused hands.
"Exceptional quality, as always, Malchi," he said in Greek. Even I, at 7 years old, could speak 3 languages: Aramaic at home, Hebrew in the synagogue, Greek on the street. That's how you survived in Cyrene. My patron will be satisfied. "When does the ship leave?" my father asked, making quick mental calculations about payment, transport, taxes. "In the next. You!" The voice cut through the marketplace like a whip. Everyone turned. Lysander was marching toward us, and there was something dangerous in the way his eyes narrowed. He was one of the wealthiest Greek merchants in Cyrene, imported olive oil from Greece, sold it throughout North Africa. He had connections, power, and a temper everyone knew and feared. "Lysander," my father said calmly, but I felt his hand tighten on my shoulder. A silent warning: stay quiet, stay close. "How can I help you?" "You can give me back my money, you thieving Jew." The marketplace fell silent, the kind of silence that precedes violence. "Pardon?" My father kept his voice neutral, but I could feel the tension in his body. "What transaction are you talking about?" "The shipment that arrived yesterday. I paid for 20 sacks of premium wheat. Only 18 arrived, and the quality was inferior to what was agreed." "Impossible," my father said. "I supervised the loading myself. 20 sacks, all of? Are you calling me a liar?" Lysander's hand went to the hilt of the short sword he wore on his belt. Many merchants went armed. Times were turbulent, bandits were common, but everyone knew Lysander looked for excuses to use his blade. "No," my father said slowly, each word measured. "But there may have been an error in—" "The error was doing business with you." Lysander spat on the ground, near my father's feet, a deliberate insult. "Your people have always been like this, exploiters, leeches. You live among us but refuse to be like us. You worship your invisible God and think you're better than everyone." "Lysander," the ship captain began, clearly uncomfortable. "Perhaps we could—" "Shut up." Lysander didn't take his eyes off my father. "I'm talking to the Jew. So, Malchi, are you going to give me back my denarii, or am I going to have to recover them the hard way?" My father took a deep breath. I could see the calculation happening behind his brown eyes. 2 options: yield or resist.
Yielding meant losing money we didn't owe, accepting public humiliation, teaching his son that injustice must be tolerated. Resisting meant what exactly? "I'll investigate the shipment," my father said finally. "If there was an error, it will be corrected. But I won't pay for what I don't owe just because you—" The knife appeared so fast, I almost didn't see it. Lysander lunged, and suddenly there was blood. So much blood, streaming down my father's face. The cut ran from his eyebrow to his cheekbone, deep enough to leave a scar he would carry for the rest of his life. My father staggered backward. I screamed. The ship captain grabbed Lysander's arm before he could strike again. "You madman! There are Roman guards 3 blocks from here." "And you think they care?" Lysander smiled, but there was something cold and dead in that smile. Ask any Roman guard what happens when a Greek and a Jew have a disagreement. See which side they take. He was right. Everyone knew he was right. Lysander wiped the knife on his own tunic and sheathed it again. He looked at my father, who was pressing his tunic against his bleeding face, trying to stanch the flow. "You have until tomorrow at noon, 2 denarii. Otherwise, I come back, and next time it won't be just a cut on the face." He walked away calmly, as if nothing had happened. The crowd parted to let him pass. Nobody said anything. Nobody did anything. The ship captain helped my father sit. Someone brought clean water. A woman, Jewish by the veil she wore, offered a cloth for the wound. And I, at 7 years old, learned that the world wasn't fair. That being Jewish in Cyrene meant being vulnerable. That no matter how honest you were, how hardworking, how careful, there were people who could hurt you simply because they wanted to, simply because they could. "Abba," I whispered, using the Aramaic word for father, tears streaming down my face. "Does it hurt a lot?" He pulled me close with his free arm, staining my small tunic with blood. "The pain passes," he said, voice hoarse. "But pay attention, Simon. Look carefully at this moment, because this is the world you're going to inherit, and you need to learn to survive in it without losing your soul in the process." I didn't fully understand that day. It would take years and a cross in Jerusalem for me to finally comprehend what my father was trying to teach me. Chapter 2, The Scar. My father paid the 2 denarii, not because he owed them, not because it was fair, but because he had a wife and 3 young children and couldn't risk provoking more violence. The scar on his face never healed properly. It remained thick, irregular, white against his bronzed skin. Every morning, when he looked in the polished bronze mirror my mother kept, I saw him touch it. Not with shame, more like a reminder. "It's a mark of our condition," he told me once, weeks after the incident. We were in the warehouse where we stored the sacks of grain, doing inventory. The smell of wheat dominated everything, sweet, earthy, comforting. We live in their land. We prosper under their laws, but we will never be theirs, and they will never forget. "But that's unfair," I protested, with the simple indignation of a child who still believed the world should make sense. "It is," he agreed. "But what are you going to do about it, Simon? Are you going to take a knife and cut Lysander back? Are you going to gather the Jews of Cyrene and start a revolt? Are you going to become a zealot and try to expel all the Greeks and Romans?" I had no answer. "Our people have tried all of that," he continued, weighing a sack of grain, noting the weight on a wax tablet. "And always, always it ends the same way, with more Jewish blood on the ground. So you know what we do? We survive. We maintain our identity. We guard our faith. And we wait." Wait for what? The Messiah, Simon, the anointed one of Hashem, the one who will finally free us, not just from Rome or Greece, but from this endless exile. The word Messiah was common in our house. My mother spoke of him when she lit the Sabbath candles. the elders in the synagogue discussed the prophecies about his coming. It was a hope that permeated everything, invisible but constant, like salt in the sea air. But in that moment, in the warehouse, with the fresh scar on my father's face reminding everyone of our vulnerability, the Messiah seemed very distant. A beautiful story, an impossible dream. Chapter 3, Micah and the Gymnasium. I had two friends in childhood, Micah and Davos. Micah was Jewish like me, son of Eli, who worked as a carpenter in the Jewish quarter of Cyrene. He was tall for his age, all elbows and knees, with a laugh that seemed too big for his skinny body. We met at the synagogue when we were 5, and since then, we were inseparable. Davos was Greek. That created complications. His father, Sophocles, was a goldsmith who had a shop near our warehouse. Sophocles didn't hate Jews, which was already better than many, but he also didn't hide that he found our religion strange. A god you can't see or represent in image, he would say, shaking his head. How do you worship something like that? But Davos didn't care about those things. He just wanted to play, run through the narrow streets of Cyrene, invent adventures. And so, somehow, 3 boys from different worlds became friends. When I turned 8, my father decided it was time for me to receive more formal education, Greek education. The gymnasium was an impressive building in the center of Cyrene, imposing columns, open courtyard, statues of famous philosophers and athletes. Boys from wealthy families studied there. Rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, gymnastics, music. For a Jew, it was a double-edged sword. Greek education opened doors, created opportunities, but it also threatened your identity. You're going to study there, my father announced one evening during dinner, but never, never forget who you are. My mother, Rachel, was silent for a long moment. She was a small woman, but with an inner strength that rivaled any man's. Her dark eyes fixed on my father. "Malchi," she said softly, but there was steel in her voice. "You know what happens at the gymnasium. The naked games, the offerings to Greek gods, the philosophies that contradict the Torah." "I know," my father responded, "but what's the alternative? Keep him only in synagogue study? How will he do business? How will he negotiate with Greeks and Romans if he doesn't understand how they think?" "And if he learns to think like them," my mother retorted, "and forgets to think like us?" It was a real concern. Everyone knew stories of young Jews who went to the gymnasium and came out Greek in everything but name, who started going to the theater on Sabbaths, who stopped circumcising their sons, who married Gentile women. "I'll make sure he doesn't forget," my father said, taking my mother's hand. "Every morning, before the gymnasium, he studies Torah with me. Every evening, we review. And on Sabbaths, synagogue. No exceptions." That's how my life split in two. On the first day at the gymnasium, I felt completely out of place. Most of the boys already knew each other. They came from the same families, worshipped the same gods, shared the same assumptions about the world. And then there was me, Simon ben Malchi, the Jew, who wouldn't participate in sacrifices to the gods, who couldn't train naked in the gymnasium. Circumcision marked us immediately as different, who needed to leave classes early on Fridays to prepare for Sabbath. But there was one thing that saved me. I was good with words. Our rhetoric teacher, an elderly man named Philippos with a perfectly trimmed white beard, noticed this immediately. In the first week, he asked us to argue about a philosophical question. What is more important, truth or social harmony? Most of the boys chose social harmony. It was the safe answer, the Greek answer. Maintain peace, preserve order, don't cause trouble. I raised my hand. "Yes, young Simon?" "I think truth is more important," I said, my voice sounding louder than I intended in the silent hall. Because harmony built on lies eventually collapses. But truth, even when it causes discomfort at first, builds something that lasts. Philippos studied me for a long moment.
Then, slowly, he smiled. Interesting. And where does this conviction come from? From the Torah, I answered honestly. It is written, "You shall not bear false witness." Not, "You shall not bear false witness unless it hurts someone's feelings, or unless it causes problems. Just don't." One of the boys, Callias, son of a Roman magistrate, laughed with disdain. "So your invisible God says to always be truthful even when truth causes harm?" he mocked. "What kind of God makes laws like that?" "The kind of God who cares more about what's right than what's convenient," I replied, feeling my face heat but refusing to back down.
Enough, Philippos intervened. Callias, learn to debate without mocking. Simon, you made an interesting argument, but consider this. Is your truth the same truth as a Greek's, a Roman's, an Egyptian's, or does each culture have its own truth? I had no answer to that, not then. It would take years and blood on a cross for me to finally understand that there is a truth that transcends all cultures, a truth with a capital T, a truth that walked on two legs and that I, unknowingly, would carry to his execution. Chapter 4. The Price of Difference. Things got harder before they got better. Callias, the boy who had mocked me that first day, decided I would be his favorite target, and he wasn't alone. There were 3 or 4 other boys, all from wealthy families, all accustomed to getting what they wanted, who seemed to make my life a special mission.
At first, it was small things. They accidentally pushed me in the hallways. They hid my things. They made comments about how I smelled of wheat and poverty. But then it escalated. One afternoon, after classes, Micah and I were walking home together. Davos had to help his father at the workshop, so it was just the 2 of us. The path went through a more isolated street, between 2 abandoned warehouses. We should have chosen another route. Callias and his friends were waiting for us. 5 of them. 2 of us. "Look at this," Callias said, blocking our path. "The little Jews going back to their holes." "Let us pass," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I was 8 years old. Callias was 10 and much bigger. "Or what? Your invisible God gonna strike me with lightning?" The other boys laughed. They formed a semicircle around us, trapping us against the warehouse wall.
"I heard," Callias continued, taking a step closer, "that you Jews do strange things, cut parts off babies, don't eat certain foods, have rules about everything." He spat near my feet. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" "No," I said, although part of me, the part that heard my father talk about being God's chosen people, wasn't so sure. "We're just different." "Different," Callias repeated, as if the word tasted bad. "You know what we do with different things in Cyrene. We eliminate them." He advanced. What happened next is somewhat blurry in my memory. I remember Micah screaming, fists flying, pain exploding in my nose, falling to the ground and kicking blindly. Blood, my own blood this time, warm and salty in my mouth. And then, surprisingly, the screaming stopped. A new voice cut through the air. "Stop!" I opened my eyes. When had I closed them? And saw Davos, my Greek friend. He had appeared out of nowhere and was standing between us and Callias, arms spread as if he could physically stop 5 older boys. "Davos," Callias said, surprised but not exactly scared, "this isn't your business." "Yes, it is," Davos replied, and there was something in his voice, not threat but absolute conviction, that made even Callias hesitate. "Simon and Micah are my friends, and if you want to hit them, you have to hit me too." A tense silence filled the alley. Callias looked at Davos, at me, at Micah. He calculated. His father and Davos's father did business together. Complicating that for a fight with Jews probably wasn't worth it. "You're wasting your friendship on trash," Callias said finally, but he backed away. "Let's go. These Jews aren't worth our time." They left, and I remained there,
bleeding, humiliated, but alive. Davos helped me up. Micah was crying silently, more from fear than pain. "Why did you do that?" I asked Davos. "You know now Callias is going to make your life difficult too." Davos shrugged, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "Because friends defend friends," he said. "Doesn't matter if they're Jews, Greeks, or Egyptians. At least, that's what my father always says." In that moment, bleeding in a dirty alley in Cyrene, I learned something about character that's in no philosophy book. There are people who will choose right even when it costs them something, even when it's inconvenient, even when it puts them in danger. Years later, when I carried Jesus' cross and then searched to know who he was, I discovered that he had lived this principle better than anyone else. He chose right, chose love, chose sacrifice, and it cost his life. But first, I had to grow up, had to survive, had to learn all the hard lessons that Cyrene still had to teach me, and there were many. Chapter 5: Jonathan and the Rebellion That Never Happened. I met Jonathan ben Aaron when I was 12 years old. He appeared at the synagogue one Sabbath morning with his father, a thin man with feverish eyes whom everyone whispered was a secret zealot. Zealots were Jews who rejected any compromise with Rome, who believed that violence was not just justified, but ordained by God to expel the occupiers. Most families in our community kept their distance from zealots. It was too dangerous. Rome didn't tolerate rebellion, and when it punished collectively. A revolt could mean the destruction of entire communities. But Jonathan was different from his father. Where Aaron was tense and paranoid, Jonathan was cheerful and open. He had an easy smile and a way of making even the most serious people laugh. We became friends quickly, although our fathers didn't entirely approve. "Be careful with that boy," my father warned me. "It's not the son's acts that worry me, it's the father's ideas that will eventually contaminate the son." But I was 12 and thought I knew more than my father. Jonathan was 14, which seemed infinitely older and wiser at the time. And he told me stories about heroic revolts, about Judas Maccabeus, who had defeated the Syrians centuries before, about how God promised the land of Israel to the Jews, and nobody, not even Rome, had the right to take it from us. "Your father is wrong," Jonathan told me one afternoon. We were at the harbor, watching Roman ships being loaded. Warships, with their cargo of soldiers and military equipment. "Your father acts like survival is enough, like just continuing to exist is victory. But what kind of existence is that? Always afraid? Always submissive? Always accepting injustice? And what's the alternative?" I asked. "Start a revolt that's going to get us all killed?" "Maybe," Jonathan said, his dark eyes gleaming. "But I'd rather die standing than live on my knees." It was a catchy phrase, beautiful, heroic, and completely wrong about how the real world worked. But I didn't know that yet. Chapter 6: The Plan. Jonathan's plan was simultaneously bold and stupid. There would be a Roman celebration in 2 weeks, Emperor Tiberius's birthday. Local Roman officials would organize a festival, games, sacrifices to Roman gods, patriotic speeches, and, of course, a military parade through the city. "That's when we act," Jonathan announced to our small group. There were 5 of us: Jonathan, me, Micah, a boy named Tobias from the butcher's family, and Daniel, who was only 10 but insisted on participating. "Act how?" Micah asked, skeptical. "During the parade," Jonathan explained, lowering his voice although we were alone in an abandoned warehouse near the harbor. "When the Romans are marching down the main street, we'll climb on the roofs and drop banners, large banners with prophetic scriptures about the fall of pagan empires." Silence. "That's it?" Tobias finally asked. "Banners?" "Banners are a start," Jonathan said defensively. "It's a statement, a reminder that Rome won't last forever, that Hashem judges all empires." "It's also a great way to get us arrested," I said slowly, beginning to realize how dangerous this really was. "Only if we get caught," Jonathan smiled. "And we won't. We have everything planned." For the next 2 weeks, Jonathan involved us completely. We got fabric and paint. We wrote verses in Hebrew. For the kingdom is the Lord's, and he rules over the nations. The kingdoms of this world will become the kingdom of our God. The gold and silver belong to the Lord. My mother noticed something was wrong. Simon, she pulled me aside one evening, is there something you need to tell me? No, Ima, I lied, using the Aramaic word for mother. She held my face with both hands, forcing me to look her in the eyes. I don't know what you and that Jonathan boy are planning, she said softly, but I know it's dangerous. And I want you to understand something. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is doing the right thing even when you're afraid. But recklessness isn't courage. Recklessness is just pride disguised as virtue. Just promise you'll think carefully before doing anything irreversible. I promised, but I didn't think. Not enough. Chapter 7, The Day of Rebellion. The day arrived with clear blue sky and warm breeze from the sea. The parade would start at noon. At 10 in the morning, we met at the warehouse. Jonathan was radiant, his eyes shining with fervor. Today, he declared, we make history. But when I looked at the others' faces, Micah, pale and nervous, Tobias, chewing his lip, Daniel, too small to fully understand the gravity, I felt a chill in my stomach. Jonathan, I began, maybe we should reconsider. No, he cut me off. Not now. We've planned everything. Simon, you were enthusiastic about this yesterday. What changed? I thought about what my mother said, I admitted, about the difference between courage and recklessness. Your mother is afraid, Jonathan said, not cruelly, but with absolute certainty. Like all parents. But we're young. We don't have wives, children, businesses to protect. If we don't take risks now, when will we? It was a seductive argument, and I was young enough, proud enough, foolish enough to be seduced. Okay, I said finally, let's do it. We positioned ourselves on rooftops along the main street. The banners were ready, rolled up, and hidden. The plan was simple. When the main Roman commander passed directly below, we would drop the banners simultaneously, create momentary chaos, and disappear in the confusion. Simple. Except it's never that simple. The parade started punctually. Roman soldiers marched in perfect formation, their armor gleaming in the sun. The crowd, mostly Greek, some Jews keeping respectful distance, applauded politely. There were musicians, priests carrying statues of Roman gods, officials in white togas. And then the commander, Lucius Cassius Longinus, military governor of Cyrene, a hard man of 50 with battle scars and a reputation for not tolerating insurrection. Now, Jonathan whispered intensely. We dropped the banners. For one glorious moment, it worked. The enormous fabrics unfurled, Hebrew words shouting prophecies about the fall of pagan empires. The crowd gasped. Soldiers stopped, confused. The commander raised his hand, halting the parade. And then, everything fell apart. Daniel, our youngest member, panicked. Instead of hiding on the roof as planned, he stood up, perfectly visible against the blue sky. There, a soldier shouted, pointing, on the roof. What happened next was chaos. Soldiers began climbing the buildings. We ran, jumping from roof to roof, trying to reach the escape stairs we had identified. But Daniel was too small, too slow. I saw him stumble, saw a Roman soldier reach him. And without thinking, without planning, just acting on pure instinct, I ran back. Simon, no! Micah shouted behind me. But I was already there, grabbing Daniel's arm, pulling him away from the soldier who was inches from catching him. Run! I shouted at Daniel, pushing him toward the nearest ladder. And then, strong hands grabbed me. I fought, kicked, bit, but I was 12 years old, and the Roman soldier was a trained adult man. In seconds, I was immobilized, my face pressed against the hot roof tiles. Got one, the soldier shouted. I saw Micah disappear onto the next roof. Saw Jonathan hesitate. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and then he too ran. They escaped. I didn't. I was dragged down, thrown into the street, surrounded by soldiers with swords drawn and angry faces. And Lucius Cassius Longinus, military governor of Cyrene, looked at me with something that could have been curiosity or could have been disdain. "A boy," he said in Latin to his officers, "just a stupid Jewish boy." Then, in Greek so I could understand, "What's your name?" I should have lied, but I was too afraid, too confused. "Simon ben Malki," I whispered. "Ben Malki," he tested the words. "Son of Malki, the grain merchant?" I nodded, and my heart sank. They knew who my father was, which meant my stupidity wasn't just going to destroy me, it was going to destroy my entire family. Chapter 8: The Cell. The Roman prison in Cyrene was in the basement of the administrative building, 3 levels below the street. There were no windows, no natural light, only torches attached to the stone walls that projected dancing shadows and left the air thick with oily smoke. The smell was unbearable, a mixture of human urine, mold, vomit, and something worse I couldn't identify. Fear, perhaps. Fear had a smell. They threw me in a cell with 3 other men. One was too old to pose a threat, hunched in a corner, muttering prayers in a dialect I didn't recognize. The other 2 were younger, maybe 20, and the way they looked at me when I entered made my stomach turn. "Look at this," one of them said, grinning. 2 front teeth were missing. "They sent us a boy." "Leave him alone, Marcus," the other said, but there was no kindness in his voice, just boredom. Not worth it. Marcus considered this, then shrugged and went back to examining his dirty nails. I huddled in the farthest corner, hugging my knees to my chest. I tried to control my breathing, tried not to think about what my father would say when he found out, tried not to imagine what the Romans would do to me. I failed at all those things. How long did I spend there? Hours? Days? Time meant nothing in that sunless hole. Sometimes guards brought food, if that could be called food. Bread so hard you had to moisten it with dirty water to chew. Something that was supposedly broth, but smelled like sewer water. I couldn't eat. My stomach was too tight with terror. It was on what I thought was the 2nd day, or maybe the 3rd, that I heard footsteps descending the stairs. Heavy footsteps, confident, accompanied by the jingling of keys. "Simon ben Malchi!" I stood up, my legs shaking so hard I almost fell. The guard opened the cell door. "You have a visitor." They took me to a small room on the level above, still underground, but at least it had a high window through which a thin ray of light entered. And there, waiting with crossed hands and an expressionless face, was my father. Lysander's scar was a white line against his skin, his eyes fixed on me, reading every injury, every dirt stain, every evidence of how long I'd spent in that hell. The guard left, closing the door but staying outside. We had privacy, but not freedom. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then my father said, his voice so controlled it was almost worse than shouting, "Explain." The words came out in a torrent. Jonathan's plan, the banners, the temptation to do something heroic, the complete disaster that followed. I talked and talked until my voice cracked, until tears streamed down my face, until I had nothing left to say but, "Sorry, Abba, sorry, sorry, sorry." My father listened to everything without interrupting. When I finally fell silent, he took a deep breath. "Do you have any idea," he began, each word measured and precise, "what you've done? Not just to yourself, but to all of us." "I know," I whispered. "I know, and..." "No," he raised his hand. "You don't know, so I'll explain. When you were captured, when your name was recorded, our family's house was marked. The Romans now know that Malchi, the grain merchant, has a son who participated in an anti-Roman demonstration. Do you think they'll forget that? Do you think this won't affect our business, our security, our position in the community? Each word was a stab. And your siblings. Elisheva is 9 years old. Joram is 7. Aaron is 4. Did you think about them when you decided to be a hero? I hadn't thought. Of course I hadn't. I'd only thought about myself, the momentary glory, the feeling of doing something important. But the worst, my father continued, and now his voice was cracking too. The worst is that you could have died, Simon. Do you understand that? Commander Longinus had every right to execute you on the spot. A Jewish boy interrupting an imperial parade? He could have crucified you as an example. The word crucified made something inside me freeze. Crucifixion was Rome's favorite punishment for insurrection. I had seen men on crosses along the roads, left there to die slowly, sometimes taking days, always in public view as a brutal warning. This happens to those who defy Rome. So why didn't he? I whispered. Because, my father said wearily, I negotiated. I used every favor I was ever owed, every connection I've built in 20 years of trade. I called goldsmith Sophocles, who has relations with Roman officials. I called Captain Nicolaus, who transports our grain and knows people in the administration. I argued that you were just a foolish child influenced by others. I offered financial compensation for disruption of public peace. He stopped, rubbed his face with both hands. It cost almost everything we've saved in 5 years, Simon. Everything. But I got your freedom. Shame, real, overwhelming, impossible to carry shame, fell on me like a physical wave. I sank to the cold stone floor and cried, not like a boy trying to look brave, like a child who finally understood how much he had lost, how much it had cost. My father knelt beside me. He pulled my head against his chest. And for the first time since I was arrested, I felt something besides terror. I felt love, unconditional, undeserved, incomprehensible love. You're going home today, he said softly, but there are conditions. Commander Longinus requires that you work in the government warehouses for 6 months, no pay. It's hard work, carrying sacks, organizing stock, and you'll be under supervision the whole time. One wrong step, and you're back in the cell, this time without rescue. I'll do it, I said immediately. I'll do anything. And Jonathan Ben Aaron, he asked, was he arrested too? No, he escaped. My father was silent for a moment. So you paid the price for his rebellion, he observed. There was no accusation in his voice, just a statement of fact. Remember that, Simon. Leaders who don't face the consequences of their decisions aren't true leaders. They're just charismatic people letting others pay for their courage. It was a lesson I never forgot. Years later, when I carried Jesus's cross and then discovered who he was, I discovered something extraordinary. Jesus wasn't a leader who sent others to die for him. He went first, died first, paid the highest price. But that was still very, very far away. Chapter 9, The Government Warehouses. The work started the day after my return. I reported at 4 in the morning to the complex of government warehouses, 3 enormous stone buildings near the harbor, where Rome stockpiled grain, olive oil, wine, and other supplies essential for the province. The supervisor was a man called Decimus, a Roman by birth, but who had spent so much time in Cyrene that he spoke Greek better than Latin. He had arms thick as tree trunks and scars that suggested prior military experience. "You're the Jewish boy," he said when I introduced myself. It wasn't a question. "The one who interrupted the parade." "Yes, sir." He studied me with eyes that revealed nothing. Then, abruptly, "How old are you?" 12, sir." 12. He shook his head. "When I was 12, I was already in the army training. But you Jews coddle your children, and look where that leads." He gestured to the warehouse behind him. "Welcome to your punishment."
6 months. You'll work under Rufus. Rufus was a slave. Not Jewish, not Greek, not Roman. He was from Germania, captured in one of the northern campaigns years before, sold in the slave market, bought by the provincial government for manual labor. He was enormous, not just tall, but broad, with muscles that seemed carved from granite. He had blonde hair, almost white, tied in a thick ponytail, and blue eyes so clear they looked like ice. And scars. God, so many scars. On his arms, neck, one particularly horrible one, running from his ear to his chin. "This is Simon," Decimus said to Rufus in Greek. "He works for you for the next 6 months. Teach him what he needs to know. Keep him alive, keep him productive."
Rufus looked at me. His eyes measured me, evaluated me, processed me. "He's small," he finally said, his voice deep with a heavy Germanic accent. "It's what we have," Decimus replied. "Make it work." And so began the 6 most brutally difficult months of my young life. Chapter 10: Lessons from a Slave. Rufus didn't talk much. He demonstrated. On the first day, he took me to a pile of grain sacks, each weighing maybe 20 kilos. He picked one up, threw it on his shoulder as if it were nothing, carried it to the other side of the warehouse and stacked it carefully. He came back, pointed at me, pointed at the sacks. I grabbed a sack and almost fell under the weight. My knees buckled, my back screamed. But I managed to hoist it somehow, staggering under the load, crossing the warehouse in stumbling steps that probably looked comical. When I stacked the sack, poorly, I discovered later, Rufus had to reorganize everything. I was sweating, gasping, my muscles trembling. Rufus just pointed back to the pile. There were 147 more sacks. On that first day, I managed to transport 15 before my body simply stopped responding to commands. I literally collapsed on the stone floor of the warehouse, unable to get up. Rufus watched me for a moment. Then, without saying anything, he took his own water bottle and offered it to me. I drank like a man in the desert. "Small," he said, the first word he directed at me, "but learns. This is good." It took 2 weeks until I could carry all the sacks in one day. My body transformed, not dramatically. I was still 12 years old, but muscles I never knew I had began to appear. My hands developed thick calluses. My back stopped protesting at every movement. And Rufus, slowly, began to talk. "You know why I'm a slave?" he asked one afternoon while we organized barrels of olive oil. "No, sir."
"Don't call me sir. I'm a slave. No title." He lifted a barrel that easily weighed 50 kilos as if it were empty. "I was a warrior in my tribe, good warrior. I killed many Romans when they came to our lands." He placed the barrel in position, perfectly aligned with the others. "But Rome doesn't fight like we fought. We fought with courage, with individual strength. They fought with strategy, formation, discipline. When the battle ended, all my brothers were dead. I survived." He showed the scar on his face. "This is from a Roman gladius, the blade that made me a slave." Do you hate the Romans?" Rufus considered the question while picking up another barrel. "Hate?" he repeated. "Yes. No. Both." He paused, searching for words in Greek that clearly weren't natural to him. "Rome took my freedom, took my land, took my identity. Everything I was, they destroyed. But," he touched the scar, almost affectionately, "they also taught me that brute strength isn't enough, that surviving requires more than muscles, requires," he frowned, searching for the word, "adaptation. But you're still a slave." "Yes, but I'm alive. My brothers, the brave, the courageous,
The ones who refused to bow, they're dead. Their wives were sold. Their children, if they survived, grow up not knowing who their fathers were. He looked directly at me. You understand what I'm saying, Jewish boy? I wasn't sure I understood, but I nodded anyway. Courage without wisdom is just another word for suicide, Rufus said. Remember that. Chapter 11. The Weight of the World. The months in the warehouses changed more than my body. They changed my perspective. Before the arrest, I saw the world in simple categories: Jews and Gentiles, right and wrong, freedom and oppression. But working alongside Rufus, meeting other workers, some free, some slaves, some in ambiguous situations between the two, I began to understand that the world was infinitely more complicated. There was Marcus, a Greek dock worker who had been working there for 15 years. He had a wife and 4 children he supported with wages that barely covered food. I'm free, he told me once with bitter laughter, but my children eat less than some well-treated slaves. So what kind of freedom is that? There was Ptolemy, an Egyptian who had been a scribe before problems with creditors forced him into manual labor. He spoke 7 languages and could do complex calculations in his head, but spent his days stacking sacks like any illiterate. And there was Lucius. Yes, a Roman, but from the lower class, without connections, without an influential family. He had served in the army, fought in the wars of Germania, ironically at the same time Rufus was on the other side, but a knee injury ended his military career. Now he supervised the warehouse for wages that barely supported his wine habit. The system is broken, he confessed to me one evening, after the others had gone and he was drunk enough for brutal honesty. Rome conquered the world, but who benefits? The senators and their villas, the emperors with their orgies, the generals with their estates. But men like me who bled for Rome, we're discarded. These conversations, fragmented, happening during brief breaks for water, during walks back home, wove an understanding that no philosophy teacher at the gymnasium had ever given me. Suffering wasn't exclusively Jewish. Oppression had many forms. And Rome, for all its power, its organization, its magnificent roads and impressive aqueducts, was built on the backs of millions who would never see the benefit of its greatness. Chapter 12. Jonathan returns. 4 months into my punishment, Jonathan appeared. It was the Sabbath, my only day off, and I was at the synagogue with my family when I saw him enter. He had changed, was taller, thinner, and there was something in his eyes that wasn't there before, something hard. After the service, he approached me in the courtyard. Simon, Jonathan. An uncomfortable silence stretched between us. Around us, Jewish families conversed, children ran, life continued. But between us, there was a weight of unspoken things. I heard what happened, he finally said, that you were arrested, that your father had to pay ransom. Heard, I repeated, disbelief tinging my voice. You were there, Jonathan. You saw me get caught, and you ran. I had no choice. His words came out defensive, too quick. If I'd stayed, both of us would have been captured. It wouldn't have helped anything. You're right, I said calmly. Months of hard work, of conversations with Rufus about courage versus recklessness had taught me something. It wouldn't have helped. But it also wasn't about helping, was it? It was about leadership. You planned everything. You convinced us to participate. And when it went wrong, you were the first to disappear. That's not fair, isn't it? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. My father paid 5 years of savings for my freedom, Jonathan. 5 years. My little siblings are going to grow up with less because I was foolish enough to follow you. And where were you while I was in a Roman cell with criminals? He didn't answer. So don't come here talking about choices, I continued. You had choices, and you chose your safety over our well-being. A true leader would have stayed, or at least would have come to visit me.
offered to help my family, something, but you disappeared. Jonathan looked genuinely shocked, as if this possibility had never occurred to him. I didn't know what to do, he finally admitted. My father said to keep my distance, that any association could compromise us too. Your father, I said, is training you to be exactly like him, a zealot who talks about sacrifice but never risks anything personally, who inspires others to die for the cause but always finds a reason for his own preservation. It was cruel. I knew it was cruel, but it was also true. Jonathan stood there, visibly struggling between anger and shame. Finally, shame won. You're right, he whispered. I failed you. Failed as a friend, as a leader, as everything. Part of me wanted to accept the apology, forgive, move on. But another part, the part that had grown in those 4 months, knew that some fractures can't be fully mended. I accept your apology, I said finally. But Jonathan, don't ask me to follow you again. Don't ask me to trust your judgment. Those things you lost. He nodded slowly, tears glistening in the corners of his eyes. And then he turned and left, and I never spoke to him again. Years later, I heard he had joined the Zealots for real, that he had died in a minor skirmish with Roman soldiers near Alexandria. He was 22 years old. I grieved when I learned, not because I hated him, but because he represented so many. Jews full of passion and courage, but without the wisdom to choose the right battles, without the patience to wait for the right moment, without the willingness to follow instead of always leading. The Messiah, when I finally met him, was different. He led, yes, but he also served. He washed feet. He touched lepers. He ate with sinners. And when the hour came, he didn't run. He went to the cross. But I still had years of lessons before I was ready to understand that. Chapter 13, The Last Day in the Warehouses. 6 months dragged on and suddenly flew by. On my last day in the warehouses, Decimus called me into his small office, a stuffy room full of scrolls, wax tablets, and the constant smell of ink and dust. Your time is up, he announced without preamble. You've fulfilled your sentence. You're free to go. It should have been pure relief. Instead, I felt something strange, almost sadness. Sir, I said hesitantly, can I say goodbye to Rufus? Decimus looked at me curiously. You made friends with the Germanic? He taught me a lot, sir. Like what? I thought, how to articulate months of lessons, of fragmented conversations, of working side by side. He taught me that strength isn't just muscle, I finally said. That survival sometimes looks like defeat, but isn't. That dignity doesn't depend on freedom, but on how you behave in circumstances you can't control. Decimus was silent for a long moment. Rufus was a prince, he said abruptly. Did you know? I blinked, shocked. What? In his tribe, son of the tribal chief, heir to what they call a kingdom, though it's just a collection of villages in a muddy forest. Decimus leaned back in his chair, making it creak. When Rome conquered, he had a choice, swear allegiance or die. Most princes choose death. They prefer to die free than live bowed. But Rufus chose life, chose slavery. Why? Ask him, Decimus said. You've earned the right. I found Rufus where he always was, in the warehouses, working with the silent efficiency that characterized everything he did. Decimus released me, I said. Rufus nodded. I know. You were a prince? He stopped mid-movement, a barrel half lifted. Slowly, he set it back down. Decimus has a big mouth, he muttered. Why did you choose to live? I pressed. Decimus said most princes choose death. Why were you different? Rufus turned to face me completely. His ice-blue eyes studied me, deciding if I deserved the truth. My father, he began slowly, died in battle, bravely, fighting until his last breath. My 2 older brothers too. They died with swords in their hands and war cries on their lips. Heroes, all of them.
He paused. But also dead, and dead men can't protect anyone. When the battle ended, Rome took the women of our tribe, including my mother, my sisters. They offered a choice. I swear allegiance, become a slave, and my family receives protection. Or I die honorably, and my family is sold to brothels in Rome. The air left my lungs.
So I chose, Rufus continued. I chose to be a coward in the eyes of my ancestors. I chose to carry the shame of slavery because I chose for my mother not to be raped, for my sisters not to be used until they died. Does that make me weak? No, I whispered. It makes you stronger than any warrior. Rufus gave something that could have been a smile, but it was hard to tell under the thick beard. You learn fast, Jewish boy. That's why I'm telling you this. The world is changing. Rome won't last forever. Nothing lasts. But when change comes, it won't be by men who die heroically. It'll be by men who survive, who adapt, who choose life, even when it's harder than death. He put his enormous hand on my shoulder. Be that kind of man, Simon ben Malchi. Not because it's glorious, because it's necessary. I never saw Rufus again after that day, but I carry his words with me, always.
And when I carried Jesus' cross, when I felt the weight of the blood-stained wood on my shoulders, when every instinct screamed to drop it and run, but I continued, it was Rufus's voice I heard. Choose life, even when it's harder than death. Chapter 14, Back to the Gymnasium. Returning to the gymnasium was strange. I had changed. The 12-year-old boy who entered the warehouses wasn't the same 12-and-a-half-year-old who left. My body was stronger, yes, but more than that, my perspective had expanded in ways my classmates couldn't understand. Callias was still there, of course, still bullying, still cruel, but when he tried his first provocation with me, something about smelling like a dirty Jew, I just looked at him. Not with fear, not with anger, with something worse, indifference. Because compared to being in a Roman cell surrounded by criminals, compared to carrying 100 kilos of grain in the relentless heat, compared to all the lessons I'd learned about real suffering in the real world, Callias was just an annoying boy with a rich father. And he noticed. I didn't say anything, didn't need to, but something in my gaze made him back away, confused by his own reaction.
My studies also changed. Philosophy, which before seemed abstract and distant, suddenly had immediate application. When Philippos, our teacher, had us read Plato on justice, my hand went up. Plato says justice is harmony of the soul, each part doing what it should do, I said. But what happens when the system that governs us is fundamentally unjust? When princes become slaves, workers starve while the elite wastes wealth, children suffer for their parents' mistakes. Philippos studied me with renewed interest. You've changed, young Simon. I spent 6 months in the government warehouses, I replied. You tend to change when you see how the world really works. And what did you learn? I learned, I said slowly, choosing words carefully, that philosophy without practical application is just an intellectual game. That justice isn't an abstract concept, but a concrete necessity. And that Greek philosophers failed to address the real suffering of real people. Silence in the hall.
Then Philippos surprisingly smiled. Finally, he said, a student who understands that philosophy should make us uncomfortable, not comfort us. Continue, Simon. You may become a true philosopher yet. But I didn't want to be a philosopher. I wanted to be a man who made a real difference. It would take years and a cross to discover how. Chapter 43, Friday morning. On Friday morning, rumors ran that Jesus had been taken to Pilate. Pontius Pilatus, Roman governor of Judea, was the only one who could authorize execution. Jewish leaders could condemn, but not execute. Rome kept that power firmly in hand. Pilate won't do anything, I said confidently. Romans don't care about Jewish theological disputes.
He'll release Jesus just to irritate the priests. I was wrong. Around 9 in the morning, we heard the cry rising from the Antonia fortress, where Pilate kept his office. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Deborah turned pale. No. We went out into the streets. Crowds were converging on the fortress. The atmosphere was ugly. Not the joy of pilgrims celebrating, but a mob's hunger for blood. "What's happening?" I asked a man nearby. Pilate offered a choice, he said, spitting on the ground. "Release Jesus or Barabbas." The crowd chose Barabbas. Barabbas? The murderer? The priests incited the crowd, promised things, made threats. And the people, he shook his head with disgust. The people always choose wrong. Chapter 44, the Via Dolorosa. Around noon, the procession began. 3 men condemned to crucifixion, 2 common thieves, and Jesus of Nazareth. I didn't intend to be there. I swear I didn't. We had planned to stay home, keep the boys away from the horrible spectacle. But the streets were so packed, so chaotic, that we found ourselves pushed along with the crowd.
And suddenly, we were there, on the Via Dolorosa, the road of sorrow that led from the fortress to Golgotha, the place of the skull, where executions happened. Jesus staggered ahead, carrying the crossbeam of his cross. He had been beaten severely. His face was so swollen it was almost unrecognizable. Blood streamed from a crown of thorns they had jammed on his head in cruel mockery. "Look at the King of the Jews," soldiers mocked. He fell, didn't trip, literally collapsed, legs giving out under the combination of torture, blood loss, and weight of the cross. Soldiers kicked him, ordering him to get up, but his body simply wouldn't respond anymore. The centurion in charge looked around, irritated. They were behind schedule. They wanted to finish the crucifixions before Sabbath began at sunset, and this condemned man was delaying everything. His eyes landed on me. "You" was obviously strong. Years of manual labor had built muscles, and by my face, clothes, accent when I had spoken, he knew I was Jewish, but not from Jerusalem, a foreigner, without important political connections. "You," he pointed directly at me. "Cyrenian, come here." My heart froze. "Sir, now." Strong hands, other soldiers, grabbed me by the shoulders and dragged me out of the crowd. Deborah screamed. Alexander tried to follow me but was pushed back. The centurion pointed at the fallen cross. "Pick that up. Carry it to Golgotha." "But pick it up." My hands touched the wood, and the blood was warm. Chapter 45, the weight. I didn't expect the weight, not just physical, though it was brutal, the beam of wood easily weighing 50, 60 kilos, but emotional, spiritual. This was an instrument of execution, the tool they would use to kill a man who, just days before, had been teaching about love and the kingdom of God. Jesus had gotten up somehow, staggering ahead. Each step seemed impossible, each breath a labor. I followed him, carrying his cross, and 1,000 thoughts bombarded my mind. "He's innocent," part of me screamed. "He did nothing wrong. He just taught, healed, loved." "But he blasphemed," another part whispered. "He claimed to be God. That's unforgivable." Or he was telling the truth. The street was narrow, crowd pressed tight on both sides. Some mocking, spitting, others weeping. Women especially, crying out loud, lamenting. Jesus stopped, turned to them. "Daughters of Jerusalem," he said, voice hoarse but still carrying strange authority. "Don't weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children." Even now, even destroyed, he was thinking of others. We continued climbing, uphill street, each step harder than the last. Sweat poured down my face, muscles screamed, but I continued. Because what else could I do? Jesus fell again. Soldiers lifted him brutally. One of the women, brave, defying the soldiers, ran forward with a cloth. She wiped his face gently. The image of his face remained on the cloth. Blood and sweat and something more. Something that made her look at the cloth afterward with reverence, as if it were a holy thing. Finally, we arrived. Golgotha. Dark stone skull where executions happened. There were already crosses there. Those of the 2 thieves being raised. Men screaming as nails were hammered through wrists and feet. I dropped the beam. My hands were stained with his blood. Warm, bright red. A soldier pushed me back. "You can go, Cyrenian." But I couldn't move. I watched them lay Jesus on the wood. Watched the hammering of the nails. 3 blows each. Horrible metallic sound. Watched the cross being raised. Jesus suspended between heaven and earth. And I saw the sign that Pilate had ordered nailed above his head in 3 languages: Hebrew, Latin, Greek. Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews.
Insult, but also, somehow perversely, truth. Chapter 46, 3 hours. I should have left, should have returned to my family, shielded my sons from the horror, tried to forget what had just happened. Instead, I stayed. Not close, couldn't bear to be too close, but on a neighboring hill where I could see everything. Others stayed too. A small group of women at the foot of the cross. One of Jesus's disciples, a young man someone called John. Some curious onlookers, some mockers. Crucifixion wasn't a quick death. It was slow, torturous. The body sagged, pulled by its own weight, compressing the lungs. To breathe, you had to push with your feet, but feet were nailed, so each breath was agony. It could take days. Jesus lasted 3 hours. During that time, he spoke. Not much. Each word cost breath, cost pain. But what he said? "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." He was praying for those who were crucifying him, for the soldiers who nailed him, for the crowd that shouted for his death, forgiving. One of the thieves crucified with him, repentant, recognizing his own guilt, begged, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus, even in the agony of the cross, promised, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise," offering hope on the threshold of death. To his mother and to John, the disciple, "Woman, behold your son, behold your mother," ensuring they would be cared for. Even at the end, loving, serving, thinking of others. Around 3 in the afternoon, something changed. The sky darkened, not gradually like a sunset, but abruptly, as if God had turned off the sun. Unnatural darkness fell over Jerusalem. People murmured, frightened, some fled. And Jesus cried out, his voice echoing through the darkness. "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani?" My God, why have you forsaken me?" A cry of abandonment that pierced my soul. He was quoting a psalm, Psalm 22, which every Jew knew. It begins with despair, but ends in triumph. But in that moment, hanging between heaven and earth, it seemed only like despair. Minutes later, he said, "I thirst." Someone soaked a sponge in vinegar, put it on a reed, lifted it to his lips. He drank. Then, with a voice that somehow carried through the darkness and the fear and all the horror of Golgotha, he declared, "It is finished." And bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. In that moment, we felt it. The earth shook. Not a full earthquake, but a definite tremor that made even Roman soldiers step back. And from somewhere in the city, from the temple, we heard a cry of horror. We learned later what happened. The veil of the Holy of Holies, the massive curtain that separated the holiest place from everything else, tore from top to bottom, tore by itself.
The Roman centurion who had forced me to carry the cross, who had supervised the execution, who had seen so many deaths he should have been immune. He looked at the dead Jesus and whispered with something like wonder, "Truly, this was the Son of God." Chapter 47, Nightfall. I returned to our lodging in something like a trance. Deborah met me at the door. She looked at my hands, still stained with blood, and said nothing. Just pulled me inside, brought water, washed my hands gently. Alexander and Rufus were waiting. Their faces were mirrors of shock and confusion. "Abba," Alexander finally said, "what did we just witness?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know." "He was just teaching," Alexander continued, voice cracking, "talking about love, about the kingdom of God. Why did this happen?" Rufus, quiet until now, spoke. "Because truth always threatens power, and power always tries to destroy truth." I looked at my younger son, 14 years old, but speaking with wisdom beyond his age. "Do you think he was truth?" I asked. "I know he was." "How do you know?" "Because," Rufus said simply, "liars don't forgive while dying. Charlatans don't offer paradise to thieves. Imposters don't quote scripture until their last breath." He looked at me with those calm eyes. He was exactly who he said he was. We just didn't understand what that meant. The Sabbath began at sunset. Jerusalem became strangely quiet. Empty streets, people in homes. The law required rest, but there was no rest in our hearts. I couldn't stop thinking. The warm blood, the weight of the cross, 3 hours watching a man die. The words he said, so full of love even in agony. "He forgave," I whispered to Deborah in the darkness. "They were killing him and he forgave." "I know. How does someone do that?" "I don't know, but whoever he was," she paused, "he wasn't just a man." Chapter 48, the third day. On Sunday morning, rumors exploded through Jerusalem like fire. The tomb was empty. Jesus, who had been hastily buried Friday afternoon in the tomb of a rich man named Joseph of Arimathea, was gone. The enormous stone that sealed the tomb was rolled away. Roman guards that Pilate had posted claimed that disciples had stolen the body. But others told a different story. Women who went to anoint the body with spices found the tomb empty. Angels, yes, angels, announced that Jesus had risen. And Jesus himself appeared, first to Mary Magdalene, then to other disciples. "Nonsense," I said when I first heard. My Greek education, my training in critical thinking, rebelled against the idea. The body was stolen. It had to have been. "By whom?" Deborah asked. The disciples were terrified, hiding. What interest would they have in stealing a body and inventing a lie that would put them in mortal danger? "But people don't rise from the dead." "Normal people don't," Rufus said quietly. But he wasn't normal. For 3 days, Jerusalem was divided. Religious leaders insisted it was fraud. Roman guards were bribed to spread the story of theft. But more and more people claimed to have seen Jesus, alive, talking, eating, touchable. 500 people at once, some said. It couldn't be mass hallucination. It couldn't be deception. Either it was truth, or it was the most elaborate lie ever invented. And I needed to know. Chapter 49, The Search. I spent the next weeks searching. First, I looked for Jesus' disciples. It wasn't easy. They were still hiding, afraid of arrest. But eventually, through connections, through persistence, I managed to talk to some. Peter first, a fisherman from Galilee, the unofficial leader among the 12. He was broken, guilt carved into every line of his face. "I denied him," he told me, tears streaming, 3 times, exactly as he said I would. When he needed a friend, I was a coward. "But you saw him after? After he rose?" "I saw him." Strange laugh. He made us breakfast on the beach, as if nothing had happened, as if the betrayal was just forgiven. And you believe that he really came back from the dead? Peter looked at me with fierce intensity. I saw him die, saw a spear pierce his side, blood and water pouring out. Nobody survives that. And 3 days later, he was eating grilled fish with me, as alive as you are now. He leaned forward. So yes, Simon of Cyrene, I believe, because I have no choice but to believe. I talked to Thomas, who had been skeptical too, who refused to believe until he touched Jesus' wounds personally. I put my fingers where the nails had been, he said with wonder, put my hand in the wound on his side. And he didn't rebuke me for doubting. He just said, don't be unbelieving, but believing. I talked to John, the disciple who had been at the foot of the cross, to whom Jesus had entrusted the care of his mother. I saw him raise Lazarus weeks before, John told me. The man had been dead 4 days, smelling of decomposition. Jesus spoke and he came out of the tomb, he smiled. So when they said Jesus himself rose, I wasn't surprised, just confirmed. But more convincing than any individual testimony was the collective transformation. These men, fishermen, tax collectors, zealots, had been cowards during Jesus' arrest. They fled, hid, denied. Now they were lions, teaching publicly, defying the same authorities who crucified Jesus, risking arrest, torture, death. Nobody changes like that for a lie they invented. Nobody dies for something they know is false. Chapter 50, The Encounter. 6 weeks after the crucifixion, something extraordinary happened. Jesus appeared to me. Not physically. From what I understand, his bodily appearances ceased after 40 days when he ascended to heaven. But through an experience I can't fully explain, except to say it was more real than physical reality. It was late at night. I was awake, as I often was now, wrestling with everything I had learned, with the impossibility of it, with the implications if it were true. And suddenly, he was there. Not with a body, but with a presence so undeniable that every fiber of my being knew who it was. And he spoke, not with audible voice, but with words that resonated deeper than sound. Simon, you carried my cross. Tears exploded from my eyes. I didn't want to. They forced me. I know. And it was exactly what needed to happen. Because in carrying my cross, you became an image of what each of my followers must do. Take up their cross. Follow me, even when it costs everything. But I don't understand. Why did you have to die? If you're really the Messiah, why didn't you destroy Rome? Why didn't you establish a kingdom? Because my kingdom is not of this world. It doesn't come through violence or political power. It comes through sacrifice, through love that dies so others may live. I didn't come to destroy Rome. I came to destroy death itself. And did you? You know the answer, Simon. Otherwise, you wouldn't be searching, wouldn't be wrestling. Silence. Then, I believe, I whispered. I don't fully understand. I don't know how it works, but I believe you are who you said you were, that you rose, that you are God. And what will you do with that belief? I don't know. Tell me. Go home, to Cyrene. Tell my story. Not just the crucifixion, but the resurrection. Not just death, but life. And raise your sons in my truth. And if nobody believes, some will, others won't. But your task isn't to convince, it's to witness. To tell what you saw, what you carried, what you now know. And then the presence was gone, but the promise remained. Chapter 51, Return to Cyrene. We left Jerusalem a week later.
The whole family transformed. Yonah had found peace. He visited Miriam's tomb, wept for all he had lost, but finally forgave himself. Deborah had new purpose. She saw something in Jesus' movement that resonated deeply. Love that reached all people, not just Jews. A kingdom that was bigger than politics, deeper than religion. And the boys? Alexander was full of questions, wanted to understand everything. The theology of resurrection, the mechanics of miracles, how Jesus could be human and divine. His philosophical mind was in high gear. Rufus was quieter, but there was a certainty in him that didn't come from reasoning. It came from deeper knowing. He simply knew. "I'm going to follow him," Rufus told me the night before we left. "I don't know what that means, but wherever Jesus' movement goes, I want to be part of it." "Me too," Alexander agreed, "but I want to fully understand before I commit."
They were so different, but both, each in their own way, touched. The journey back was long, but this time it wasn't just a geographical journey, it was a spiritual one. We discussed constantly. Deborah asked pointed questions about how Jesus' followers would reconcile with the Jewish community. Alexander debated every point of theology. Rufus offered insights that seemed to come from a source beyond himself. And I wrestled with the implications. If Jesus was the Messiah, what did that mean for my identity as a Jew, for my business, for relationships with friends who would never believe? Chapter 52, New Life in Cyrene. We returned to Cyrene changed, and we didn't hide it. I began telling the story, in marketplaces, in business meetings, eventually in the synagogue itself. The story of carrying the cross, of witnessing the crucifixion, of the resurrection that followed. The reaction was mixed. Some believed. A small community formed, Jews and Gentiles who had heard about Jesus, who wanted to follow his teachings. Others thought I had gone mad, that the trauma of carrying the cross had broken something in me. And some, especially the synagogue leadership, saw me as a traitor, as someone who was leading Jews away from traditional faith. "You're dividing the community," Rabbi Eliezer confronted me, "teaching heresy." "It's not heresy to recognize the Messiah when he comes," I replied. "But your Messiah was crucified. Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. And he rose, breaking the curse, offering life." The debate continued for months, years. Some relationships fractured, others deepened. But through it all, I maintained my testimony. Chapter 53, Alexander and Rufus. My sons grew up in the new faith. Alexander, true to his nature, studied intensely. When Paul of Tarsus, a Pharisee transformed into an apostle of Jesus, visited Cyrene years later, Alexander spent weeks in deep theological discussion with him. "You should go to Jerusalem," Paul finally said. "Meet James, Jesus' brother. Meet Peter, become part of the movement at its heart." Alexander went, and never really came back. He became a leader in the early church, traveled extensively, and years later, when Mark wrote his gospel, the first written account of Jesus' life, he mentioned my sons by name. They compelled a certain Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, who was passing by, to carry the cross. My sons were known, respected, leaders. Rufus went a different path, but was equally committed. Where Alexander was a theologian, Rufus was a pastor. He cared for people, loved quietly but deeply, and eventually he too went to Jerusalem, working alongside the apostles. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, mentioned him. "Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, who has been a mother to me as well." My boys, my sons, now men of God, known throughout the burgeoning Roman Empire. Chapter 54, Deborah and I. As the years passed, Deborah and I grew together in the new faith. It wasn't easy. We faced ostracism from some in the Jewish community, lost some clients who didn't want to do business with sectarians. Our synagogue eventually asked us to leave. But we found new community,
People who believed that Jesus was the promised Messiah, that his kingdom wasn't political but spiritual, that love was the greatest commandment. We met in homes, sang psalms, broke bread as Jesus had done at his last meal, shared everything we had. It was chaotic, imperfect, beautiful. "Do you regret it?" Deborah asked me one night, years after we returned from Jerusalem. We were old now, me in my 50s, she 51. Everything we lost?
I thought about it, about friendships that ended, about status in the community we sacrificed, about the ease we gave up. "No," I finally said, "because what we gained is so much greater. I gained truth, purpose, a life that means something beyond mere survival." "And the cross?" she asked softly. "Do you still think about carrying it?" "Every day." "With regret?" "No." I took her hand. "With gratitude. Because in that moment, when his blood stained my hands, when the weight of the cross broke my soul but opened my soul, in that moment, my life changed forever, and I wouldn't trade it for anything." Chapter 55. Now, I write this at 67 years old. My hair is white, my body is tired from decades of hard work, but my heart is alive in ways it never was when I was young. Alexander is in Rome now, working with Peter and Paul. Rufus is in Jerusalem, leading the growing community there. Both are married with children of their own. Deborah is beside me, as she always has been, still asking hard questions, still challenging me, still being a partner in everything. And I tell the story. To anyone who will listen, to merchants at the harbor, to students at the gymnasium, to seekers who wonder if there's more to life than simply existing. I tell about a boy in Cyrene who wanted to change the world through rebellion, but learned that real change comes from within. About a young man who took over his father's business and learned that success without purpose is empty. About a man who carried the Messiah's cross without knowing it, and had his life transformed when he finally understood who that man was. Epilogue, for you who read. If you're reading this, whether on a scroll in Cyrene, whether in a letter copied and sent to communities throughout the empire, whether somehow in a future I can't imagine, know this. The cross wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Jesus died, but he also rose. And in doing so, he broke the power of death, sin, fear. I know because I saw. I carried the instrument of his death. I witnessed his last breath. And afterward, I witnessed the complete transformation of the men who knew him best. You don't have to believe me, but I beg you, investigate for yourself. Ask those who saw. Listen to the witnesses. Weigh the evidence. And if you find, as I found, that it's true, that Jesus really was who he said he was, then you face the same choice I faced. Ignore it and continue life as it was. Or follow. Take up your own cross. Lose your life to find it. I don't promise it will be easy. I promise it will cost something. But I also promise this. It will be truth. It will be life. It will be everything you've always searched for, but didn't know how to name. Because there is a kingdom of God, and it's breaking into this world now. Not through violence, not through political power. Through love that dies so others may live. Through a cross that becomes resurrection. Through warm blood on the hands of a confused Cyrenian who finally understood. The weight of the cross wasn't a curse. It was an invitation. And in accepting it, first physically on that Via Dolorosa, then spiritually in everyday since, I found what every human soul searches for. Not just belief, but the living presence of God, who came, died, and rose so that we could truly live. This is my story. I, Simon ben Malchi of Cyrene, father of Alexander and Rufus, witness to the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, the Messiah. May Hashem bless all who read. May you carry your crosses with courage,
And may you find, as I found, that the end of the cross is not death. It is eternal life.